An elderly man was mistreated by his son and his wife, but his grandson gave them all a great lesson. The sky, tinged with orange, announced the end of the afternoon as Don Jacinto crossed the threshold of his son's house. His pace was slow, leaning on a wooden cane he had carved with his own hands many years ago. He carried a leather satchel slung over his shoulder with only a few belongings, 2 changes of clothes, a worn-out knife, and a locket with a photo of his late wife. Baltasar was waiting at the door with his arms crossed. There were no smiles or words of welcome, only a nod indicating he should come in. "You can stay in this room," he said, pointing to a room at the end of the hallway. Jacinto walked in slowly, dragging his feet across the wooden floor. The room was small and dark, with a hard bed and an old trunk in the corner. A narrow window barely let in a bit of cold air. He left the satchel next to the bed and scanned the space silently. He did not expect luxury or comfort, just a corner where he could spend his final days. From the living room, Carmen watched him with a furrowed brow. She hadn't said anything since his arrival, but her expression said it all. For her, the presence of an old man in the house meant more work, more worries. Nicolas, on the other hand, peeked curiously from the other side of the hallway. He had never met his grandfather. He knew he had been a carpenter and had built houses in the village with his own hands, but the man he now saw before him looked nothing like the stories he had heard. His hunched back and white hair made him seem like a dry and fragile log. Dinner passed in uncomfortable silence. Jacinto sat next to the family, but his trembling hands made every movement difficult. The spoon clinked against the plate clumsily, and as he tried to bring it to his mouth, some soup spilled onto the tablecloth. Carmen turned her gaze away, suppressing a grimace of annoyance. "Did you always make furniture, Grandpa?" the boy asked suddenly. The man looked up, his tired eyes lit up for an instant. "Yes, since I was your age, I learned to work with wood," he replied. "Can you teach me?" Carmen sighed, and Baltasar took a piece of bread into his mouth without intervening. Jacinto gave a brief smile and nodded. "If you want, I'll show you when there's a chance," he said. That night, Jacinto went to bed early. Outside, the wind whistled through the rooftops, and the cold mountain air seeped through the cracks in the window. On the other side of the house, Nicolas tossed in bed, thinking about his grandfather's answer. He had never seen anyone carve wood. The idea of learning something new intrigued him. The next morning, the old man woke with the crowing of the roosters. He walked to the patio and sat on a dry log, enjoying the fresh air. He closed his eyes for a moment. In his mind, images of his old workshop returned vividly. The scent of cedar, the sound of the gouge gliding over the wood, the shavings falling like rain on the packed earth floor. But his workshop no longer existed, and his tools were a thing of the past. The following day, he decided not to sit idly by and tried to be helpful around the house. He picked up a broom to sweep the patio, but his back gave out at the first abrupt movement. He tried washing the dishes, but the tremor in his fingers caused a glass to slip and shatter on the floor. "Leave it, Don Jacinto. We'll take care of it," said Carmen, picking up the pieces with annoyance. The old man set the sponge in the sink without arguing. He returned to the patio and sat on the same log as in the morning, his hands resting on his knees. Time had turned him into a burden, and that weighed more than the years themselves. As the days passed, Nicolas began to approach him more and more. He sat next to him in the patio, asking questions about wood, trees, and the furniture he had built. Jacinto answered patiently, detailing every technique he still remembered. When he spoke, his voice regained a bit of firmness, as if those memories restored a bit of the vitality time had taken from him. One afternoon, while Carmen was finishing washing clothes at the river and Baltasar worked in the field, Nicolas approached his grandfather with an expectant expression. "Will you teach me now?" he asked. Jacinto looked at his aged hands. For years, those same hands had shaped tables, doors, and chairs. Now, they could barely hold a knife without it trembling between his fingers. But in the boy's eyes shone the same curiosity his own son had once had. "All right," he said, pulling the old knife from his satchel. He took a piece of wood he had found near the hearth and began sliding the blade over the surface, removing the first layer with slow but precise movements. Nicholas watched every detail intently, memorizing each motion. "Can I try?" he asked after a while. The old man carefully handed him the knife. The boy held it with both hands and tried to imitate him, but on the first cut, the blade slipped and nearly cut his finger. Slowly. "It's not just about strength, it's about patience," said Jacinto, adjusting the boy's fingers on the handle. Nicholas frowned and tried again, this time more gently. The first cut was clumsy, but his grandfather nodded approvingly. "That's how it starts," he said. That night, when Jacinto retired to his room, the boy ran excitedly with his roughly carved piece of wood. He hid it under the bed like a treasure, determined to keep practicing in secret. The next day, one less chair was at the family table. Jacinto ate alone in the kitchen with an old wooden plate and a nicked spoon. There were no arguments or explanations. His place at the table simply ceased to exist. Nicholas frowned at his mother but said nothing. He only glanced toward the kitchen, where his grandfather slowly chewed in silence. Something in his chest felt strange, as if something was out of place. The scene repeated every day. Jacinto no longer had a place at the table. At each meal, he settled into the corner by the hearth, with his wooden bowl and chipped spoon. No one spoke to him while he ate. No one looked at him. Nicholas, sitting with his parents, glanced at his grandfather from time to time. He saw his wrinkled hands tremble slightly as he brought the food to his mouth, the way he chewed slowly, unhurriedly, as if each bite weighed more than the last. Something inside the boy tightened, but he did not know how to name it. After lunch, Jacinto went out to the patio and sat on his usual log under the shade of the pomegranate tree. Since he had arrived, he spent long hours there, gazing at the horizon without saying anything. Nicholas watched him, his feet dangling from the chair. "Eat quickly," said Carmen, gathering the dishes. "You have to take your nap." The boy frowned but did not protest. Baltasar had already gone out to the field, and his mother did not want interruptions in her routine. Nicholas, however, had other plans. He waited in bed until silence filled the house. Then, barefoot, he slipped out of the room and walked to the patio. His grandfather had not moved from his spot. "What are you doing, Grandpa?" asked Nicholas as he approached. Jacinto turned his head and gave a faint smile. "Carving," he replied, holding a small piece of wood in his hands. The boy sat next to him and watched in fascination the slow but firm movements of the knife sliding across the surface. The wood shed thin shavings that fell to the ground like golden dust. "Today I want to make something different," said the boy, rubbing the wood between his hands. The old man looked at him with curiosity. Nicholas could already make clean, albeit clumsy, cuts. "What do you have in mind?" asked Jacinto, pulling another piece of wood from his satchel. The boy thought for a moment, pursing his lips. "A bowl like yours," he said. The man raised an eyebrow. "That's a difficult job," he warned. "But you can help me," the boy insisted. The old man smiled slightly and nodded. Calmly, he began to explain how to hollow out a piece of wood without breaking it, how to follow the grain, and how the movements had to be slow and precise. Nicholas listened attentively, trying to imitate him. Time passed without them noticing. The boy did not speak, only concentrated on each movement, on the sensation of the knife sliding over the surface. The idea of creating something with his own hands filled him with excitement. But the moment was interrupted when a harsh voice echoed from the entrance to the house. "What's all this mess?" Baltasar crossed the patio with firm steps, frowning as he saw the wood shavings scattered across the ground. Nicholas hid the knife behind his back. Jacinto said nothing. "This again, father?" said Baltasar, taking a carved piece of wood. He turned it in his hands, inspecting it with disdain. "We don't have time for these foolish things." "I was just teaching the boy," the old man replied calmly. Baltasar clicked his tongue and looked at Nicholas. "And you, instead of wasting time with this, should be helping your mother," he said. The boy lowered his head. Jacinto reached out to retrieve the piece of wood his son was holding, but Baltasar threw it to the ground. "That's enough," he said. The wood hit the stones and split in two. The boy stood still, fists clenched. Jacinto said nothing, only picked up the pieces and stored them in his satchel with the same patience as always. Baltasar sighed impatiently. I'm going to rest before going back to the field. And you, Nicolas, go inside. You are forbidden from carving again, he ordered before leaving. The boy did not move immediately. He kept looking at his grandfather, who now just stared silently at the horizon. That night, the boy hid his piece of wood under the bed and whispered with determination, I'm going to finish it, Grandpa. I will make the bowl. A little later, unable to sleep, Nicolas got up and took the bowl. After a while, small splinters pierced his fingers and his skin burned from the cuts, but he did not stop. By candlelight, he worked with clumsy movements, trying to hollow out the inside without breaking the edges. His grandfather made it look easy, but it was not. Each cut took effort. Sometimes the blade slipped and he barely managed to remove a splinter. Other times he pressed too hard and a crack opened in the surface. The boy pressed his lips together and kept trying. From his room, Jacinto heard the scraping of the knife against the wood. He said nothing. In the morning, Nicolas hid his work before his mother came in to wake him. During breakfast, his hands burned as he held the spoon, but he did not complain. Jacinto glanced sideways at him, noticing the way he curled his fingers. He asked nothing. After the meal, Carmen went about her chores, and Baltasar left for the field. Jacinto settled on his usual log in the patio, as always, and Nicolas approached him. Last night I tried carving, the boy whispered, afraid someone might hear. The man looked at him with interest. And how did it go? He whispered in the same tone. It was hard. A piece broke, he admitted. Jacinto nodded. That happens when you press too hard. Wood can't be forced, he explained. The boy hesitated for a moment before running to his room, pulling the bowl from its hiding place and returning to the patio, making sure to avoid his mother. He handed it to his grandfather, waiting for him to examine it. Jacinto took the piece gently. It was rough, uneven, with clumsy marks on the edges, but it had shape. You're doing well, he said. Nicolas smiled proudly. The man ran his fingers over the surface and handed the piece back. If you want it to last, you have to sand it carefully, he advised. How do I do that? Jacinto leaned forward a bit. Find a smooth stone. Rub it in circular motions until the edges are smooth, he said. The boy nodded with determination. That night, in the darkness of his room, Nicolas rubbed the wood against a stone he had found in the yard. The piece rotated in his hands, scraping silently under the dim candlelight. Fatigue weighed on his eyelids, but he did not want to stop. He wanted the bowl to be ready, because he knew his grandfather still did not have a place at the table, because he knew that someday his parents would grow old, and then they would understand. The next morning, Carmen entered Nicolas's room with a pile of clean clothes. When she lifted the blanket from the bed, she frowned at what she saw: wood shavings. She placed the clothes on a chair and checked under the mattress. There was the half-finished bowl, along with Jacinto's worn knife. The woman left the room with firm steps. Baltasar, she called. Her husband, who had just entered the house after fetching water, looked at her in confusion. What's wrong? Without answering, she showed him the bowl. Baltasar raised his eyebrows. Where did you find that? Under Nicolas's bed, she said. Baltasar frowned, anger rising in his body. He had forbidden the boy from carving, and now the boy had defied him. At that moment, Nicolas entered from the yard and froze when he saw them there. What's this? His mother asked, holding up the bowl. The boy swallowed hard and lowered his gaze. It's a bowl, he said softly. I can see that. But what for? Carmen pressed. The boy lifted his head and answered calmly, For when you and Dad are old, so you'll eat like Grandpa, far from me, in a corner with an old wooden bowl. Silence fell over the house. Baltasar blinked, at a loss for words, all his anger suddenly vanishing, replaced by surprise. Carmen opened her mouth but found no response. Nicolas stood still, the bowl still in his mother's hands. For the first time in a long while, Jacinto, who had followed the boy inside upon hearing the discussion, saw something different on their faces, something resembling shame. Without saying anything, Carmen placed the bowl on the table and left the room. Baltasar followed her with his eyes, but said nothing either. The boy retrieved his bowl, held it against his chest, and went out to the patio. Jacinto looked at him in silence, with a faint smile on his lips, and followed him. The days passed, and neither Baltasar nor Carmen scolded Nicolas again. They let him carve with his grandfather, as long as they did not have to face the truth of what their son had told them. The cold came suddenly, and the icy wind seeped through every crack in the house. Grey clouds had settled over the sky for days, and the dampness crept into the bones like a weight impossible to shake off. Jacinto spent that night wide awake. His chest burned, and a dry cough shook him repeatedly, leaving him breathless. He covered himself with his thin blanket, but the cold still pierced his bones. In the morning, when he tried to get up, his legs did not respond. Nicolas was the first to notice his absence in the yard. He looked in the kitchen, but his grandfather was not in his usual corner by the hearth. Worried, he ran to his room. "Grandpa," he called, pushing the door open. The man was lying on his side, his gaze lost on the wall. He barely turned his head when the boy approached. "Does something hurt?" Nicolas asked, frowning. Jacinto smiled weakly. "It's just the cold," he said, though his voice sounded hoarser than usual. The boy sat on the edge of the bed. "I'll bring you another blanket," he said, and ran out. When he returned, Jacinto had fallen asleep. Nicolas covered him carefully and sat watching him in silence. During dinner, the boy waited for his father to finish eating before speaking. "Dad, Grandpa is very sick. We should take him to the healer," he said bluntly. Baltasar drank the last sip from his cup and set it on the table. "Old people always get sick in the winter," he replied. "He'll get over it." "But he can barely get up," Nicolas insisted. Carmen sighed impatiently. "We already said we're not going to spend money on that. What he needs is rest," she said, gathering the plates. The boy felt a knot in his throat. He stayed in his chair, watching his mother stack the plates in the sink, his father wiping his hands on his pants. They weren't going to do anything, so he would. That night, Nicolas woke up before the roosters crowed. He dressed quietly, took his blanket, and left the house without making a sound. The freezing air immediately stung his skin, but he did not stop. He crossed the yard and headed down the path that led to town. The moon barely lit the rocky road, casting long shadows between the trees. He clenched his fists inside the blanket and kept walking. The healer lived on the other side of the town. Nicolas had been there once when his mother had a fever. He remembered the smell of herbs, the jars lined up on the shelves, the slow voice of the old man who prepared infusions. Now, his grandfather needed him. His grandfather, who never complained, never asked for anything, who only looked at him patiently while he tried to carve his bowl. His legs were numb when he finally saw the adobe house with the door ajar. He approached and knocked hard. A few seconds later, a figure appeared at the door. It was a thin man, with a wrinkled face and small eyes like those of a hawk. "What are you doing here at this hour, boy?" he asked in a deep voice. Nicolas swallowed. "It's my grandfather," he said, breathing heavily. "He's sick and needs help." The healer looked him up and down. Then he sighed and nodded. "Let's go," he said. And Nicolas, his heart pounding hard, knew he had done the right thing. The way back felt shorter. Nicolas walked ahead, hurrying his steps, while the healer followed in silence, with a satchel slung over his shoulder. When they reached the house, the boy headed toward his grandfather's room without making a sound, followed by the healer. "He's here," he said softly, pointing to Jacinto's room. The healer nodded and carefully pushed the door open. Jacinto was still lying down, his eyes half closed and his skin pale. His breathing was slow and heavy. The healer set his bag on the floor and approached the bed. "How long has he been like this?" he asked. Nicolas opened his mouth to answer, but a sharp voice interrupted him. "What's going on here?" Carmen appeared in the doorway, brow furrowed and arms crossed. Baltasar, behind her, wore the same puzzled expression. The boy clenched his lips. "I went to get the healer," he said, without lowering his gaze. Carmen blinked, stunned. "You went out alone in the middle of the night." Baltasar stepped forward. "Nicolas, what were you thinking?" The boy clenched his fists. "That you weren't going to do it," he replied. Silence fell over the room. The healer, paying no attention to the argument, took Jacinto's wrist and felt his pulse. "He's weak," he murmured. The couple looked at him, suddenly aware of the seriousness of the situation. "Is it serious?" Baltasar asked, his voice more subdued. "If he isn't properly cared for, he won't make it through the winter," said the healer, pulling some jars from his satchel. "I'll prepare an infusion for him, but he needs warmth, good food, and rest." The woman lowered her gaze, and the man ran a hand over his neck, uncomfortable. They said nothing as the healer got to work. In the days that followed, Jacinto remained in bed. Nicolas never left his side. He arranged the blankets, brought him infusions, and made sure he ate, even if just a little. Carmen also began spending more time in the room, though she didn't talk much. She only came in, checked that everything was in order, and left. Baltasar, on the other hand, took longer to come around. It was nearly a week later when he entered the room late at night. Jacinto was asleep. Nicolas was sitting on the floor, his head resting on the bed. The man watched them in silence. Then, with slow steps, he approached and sat on the edge of the mattress. He spent a few seconds looking at his father. His hands, once strong, now lay thin over the blanket. He sighed and lowered his head. From the floor, Nicolas half opened his eyes. Although his father said nothing that night, something in the house felt different. After that night, Baltasar insisted that Nicolas sleep in his own room, and he stayed to care for his father himself. The cold and damp had begun to ease when Jacinto showed slight signs of recovery. That morning, as he did every day for weeks, Nicolas woke up early and ran to check on his grandfather. Jacinto was still lying down, but his eyes were open. He watched the boy with a faint smile when he entered. "You look better today," Nicolas said as he approached. The man nodded slowly. "I feel less weight in my chest," he replied with a raspy voice. The boy took the blanket that had been folded in a corner of the bed and helped cover him better. Since the healer's visit, he had spent all day in bed, too weak to get up. But this time, his trembling hands managed to hold the blanket by themselves. "Did you sleep well?" the boy asked. "A little," Jacinto replied, "but I don't want to stay in bed all day anymore." Nicolas smiled. "When you get better, we can go out to the patio. I want to show you something," he said softly. The man raised an eyebrow with curiosity, but Nicolas gave no further details. Carmen appeared in the doorway with a plate of hot broth. She stopped for a moment, watching her son arrange the old man's blanket. "How is he this morning?" she asked, without the coldness from before. Jacinto looked at her, surprised. He couldn't remember the last time his daughter-in-law had asked him anything directly. "Better," he said simply. The woman nodded and set the plate on the nightstand. "Eat before it gets cold," she murmured before leaving. Nicolas watched her walk away, feeling that something had changed in his mother. Maybe, just maybe, she had begun to understand. The days went by, and Jacinto gradually regained strength. He still tired quickly, and his cough hadn't completely disappeared, but he could now sit up in bed without help and eat without the spoon trembling so much in his hands. Nicolas, for his part, kept working on his bowl. It hardly had any imperfections left, but there was still work to be done. Every night, by candlelight, he sanded the edges patiently, rubbing the wood until it became smooth. Sometimes he paused and observed his work in silence. It had begun as a rough piece of wood, full of clumsy cuts and mistakes. Now, it had shape, texture, meaning, like his family. He closed his eyes and held the bowl against his chest. Tomorrow, his grandfather would see it finished. In the afternoon, while Carmen and Baltasar were busy in the house, Nicolas entered Jacinto's room with the bowl in his hands. The old man was sitting up in bed, his back against the wall. Nicolas approached and handed it to him carefully. Jacinto took it in his wrinkled hands and ran his fingers over the smooth surface. The boy waited in silence. After a few seconds, the man smiled. "Now, it really looks like a proper bowl," he said. Nicholas's chest filled with pride. "I did well, didn't I?" he asked. The old man nodded. "You did it with patience, and that's the most important thing," he said. The boy couldn't hide his smile. From the doorway, Carmen watched them without them noticing. Her eyes dropped to the wooden bowl in the old man's hands and the voice of her son saying he made it so that they would eat from it when they grew old echoed again in her memory. She finally understood what it represented. The woman stood there in silence, watching her father-in-law and her son share a moment she had never understood until now. When she walked away, something inside her had changed. And when Jacinto woke up the next day, the house felt warmer. His body was still weak, but the fever had gone down, and his cough was less frequent. He sat up in bed with effort and looked toward the window. The day was clear. He slowly turned and saw Nicholas asleep in a chair beside the bed, his arms crossed and his head resting on his own chest. The old man smiled tenderly. He caressed the wooden bowl that rested in his lap. Nicholas had left it there the night before, after showing it to him proudly. His grandson had made it with his own hands, with patience and dedication. It wasn't just an object, it was a symbol. Slowly, he put his feet on the floor. He didn't want to wake his grandson, but he needed to go outside. He took a deep breath and leaned on the edge of the bed before standing up. His legs trembled, but didn't give out. With the cane in one hand and the bowl in the other, he walked toward the door. Baltasar was chopping firewood in the yard when he heard the creaking of wood under the slow steps of his father. He turned and froze. Jacinto was there, walking with difficulty, but on his own. He stopped by his old log and sat down with a sigh. Nicholas ran out of the house shortly after, coming to a halt when he saw his grandfather outside. "Grandpa!" he exclaimed, excited. The man smiled and patted him on the head. "I told you I wasn't going to stay in that bed forever," he joked. The boy laughed and sat next to him. Baltasar watched them from a distance. He remembered the night Carmen had found the bowl hidden under their son's bed, when the boy, with a firm voice, had said, "It's for when you and Dad are old, so you'll eat like Grandpa." Since then, those words had lingered in his mind. He wiped his hands on his pants and walked over to them. Jacinto looked up, surprised by the shadow of his son in front of him. Baltasar looked at Nicholas. "Do you have another knife?" he asked. The boy blinked. "What for?" The man pointed at the carved wood in his son's hands. "So you can teach me," he said, somewhat awkwardly. The silence lasted a few seconds. Jacinto narrowed his eyes. Nicholas, unable to hide his excitement, rummaged through his pocket and pulled out a smaller knife. "Start with this," he said, handing it to him. Baltasar took the tool carefully. "And now what?" he asked. The boy smiled. "Slowly. It's not just about strength. It's about patience," he said, repeating his grandfather's words. Jacinto let out a low chuckle. For the first time in years, Baltasar stayed with his father without anything forcing him to, without anything weighing him down. That night, when Carmen served dinner, Jacinto was surprised to see there were 4 plates on the table. For a moment, he thought it was a mistake, but then he felt Baltasar's hand on his arm. "Come on, father," he said, guiding him to the table. Jacinto sat in his old chair. Nicholas, without saying a word, placed the wooden bowl next to his plate. No one moved it. No one asked. Everyone understood what it meant. Dinner went by calmly, but the night did not. Jacinto was sleeping soundly when Nicholas passed by his room. It was late, and he had woken up because of the raised voices coming from the kitchen. With quiet steps, he approached and hid behind the doorframe. "So what? Now all of a sudden you want to make peace with your father?" his mother said in a low voice, but with a tone full of skepticism. "I just want to do things right," Baltasar replied. "You always say that. But when time passes, you'll forget about him again. You'll go back to treating him like an old piece of furniture that's in the way," Carmen accused. There was a heavy silence before Baltasar spoke again. "I don't want to repeat what he did to me," he murmured. Nicholas frowned. "What did that mean?" The woman scoffed. "He raised you alone, Baltasar. He did the best he could." "Really? That's what you think?" the man replied angrily. The boy didn't fully understand the conversation, but something in his father's voice sounded bitter. It wasn't anger, it was something deeper. He didn't want to listen anymore. He walked away from the kitchen and returned to his room. He wondered what his father's childhood had been like, why it was so hard for him to love Jacinto. The next day, Nicolas found his grandfather sitting in the yard, holding a piece of wood in his hands. The boy immediately approached. "What are you doing, Grandpa?" Jacinto smiled faintly. "It's a surprise," he said, keeping the figure partially hidden. Nicolas narrowed his eyes but didn't insist. The old man continued carving calmly. The boy noticed that his hands still trembled, but that didn't stop him from working precisely. "Grandpa," he said, hesitating a little before continuing, "what was my dad like when he was a kid?" Jacinto stopped carving. He looked up and observed his grandson for a moment, as if analyzing how much he should say. "He was a strong boy," he said finally. "He always wanted to prove he could do everything on his own." Nicolas pursed his lips. "But did you two get along?" The man sighed and lowered his gaze to the wood in his hands. "Let's say I didn't always know how to talk to him," he admitted. Nicolas didn't fully understand those words, but he sensed his grandfather looked more tired than usual. He didn't insist. At least now he knew something. His father seemed to have wounds that had never healed. The days went by calmly. Jacinto, although he still didn't have the same strength as before, spent more time in the yard, enjoying the sun and fresh air. Nicolas kept carving wood, and Baltasar, though not saying it out loud, practiced in secret. However, there was something the boy didn't understand. Every afternoon, his grandfather worked on a small block of wood, carving it patiently. But when he tried to peek to see what it was, the man covered the piece with his hands and smiled. "When it's ready, you'll know," he said with a mysterious tone. That answer only made the boy more curious. One afternoon, while Nicolas was sanding a new figure, Jacinto cleared his throat. "I've finished," he said. The boy immediately looked up. His grandfather held a small wooden sculpture in his hands. The boy blinked, observing the details. It was a figure of 3 people sitting at a table. In the center, on the polished wood, there was a bowl carved with precision. The boy took it carefully, admiring his grandfather's work. "Is that our family?" he asked softly. Jacinto nodded. "Yes," he replied. "That's how I want to remember us." Nicolas smiled, but before he could respond, a shadow fell over them. Baltasar had come out of the house and stood in front of them, silently looking at the figure. His expression was hard to read. Jacinto didn't take his eyes off his son. "Family should always have a place at the same table," the old man said calmly. Baltasar lowered his gaze to the sculpture. His hands clenched into fists, but not out of anger. After a long moment, he dropped into a log seat beside them. "It's well made," he murmured. Jacinto smiled, and Nicolas hugged his father, who accepted it somewhat awkwardly, but happily. The next morning, Jacinto woke up to the sound of the chisel striking the wood. At first, he thought he was dreaming. Throughout his life, that sound had been a familiar melody in his workshop, in the houses he built with his own hands, in every object he had shaped. But that workshop no longer existed. His hands were no longer the same. And yet, the sound was still there. He sat up slowly, supporting himself on the bed. The room was still dark, with only a ray of light filtering through the window. He got up slowly and walked to the door, guided by the noise. When he reached the yard, he stopped in his tracks. Baltasar was sitting on the log where Jacinto used to work. He had a wooden plank on his lap and was holding a chisel firmly, striking it with a mallet awkwardly but determinedly. The old man felt a lump in his throat. Baltasar hadn't noticed him yet. He was focused, frowning, correcting each cut with patience. Next to him, Nicolas watched attentively but didn't intervene. Jacinto leaned on his cane and cleared his throat. His son immediately looked up. For a moment, his expression was the same as always, tense, reserved, with a mix of discomfort and pride. But this time, he didn't look away or try to hide what he was doing. "Good morning," Jacinto said, in a raspy voice. Balthasar set the chisel down and ran a hand over his neck. "Good morning," he replied. The old man slowly moved forward and sat on another log, near his son. Nicholas, excited, pointed to the wooden piece. "Dad is making something," he said enthusiastically. Jacinto looked at the plank on Balthasar's lap. It didn't have a clear shape yet, but he could see the first cuts outlining the edges. His son had worked carefully, though there were still imperfections. The old man narrowed his eyes. "What are you trying to make?" he asked. Balthasar hesitated. Nicholas looked at his father with anticipation. Finally, the man took a breath and replied, "A table." Jacinto felt something in his chest. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't disbelief. It was pride. Balthasar, his son, was building something. For the first time, he wasn't destroying, pulling away, or denying. He was creating. The old man extended a trembling hand. "Let me see," he said. The man handed him the plank. Jacinto held it carefully, running his fingers over the cuts. There were flaws in the alignment. The edges weren't entirely straight, but the work had something more important: intention. The old man looked up. Balthasar was watching him, tense, waiting for a judgment that never came. Instead of pointing out the errors, Jacinto smiled. "It's good," he said. Balthasar relaxed his shoulders. "But there's still a lot left to do," the old man added. His son scoffed, but not with annoyance. "I already know that," he admitted. Nicholas watched them both, holding back a smile. Jacinto rested the plank on his knees and looked up. "Do you want help?" Balthasar didn't answer immediately. For years, he had rejected the idea of receiving anything from his father. For years, he had carried a resentment he couldn't fully explain. But now, sitting beside him, with the wood between them, he felt all of that weighing less. He nodded without smiling. "Yes," he said. Jacinto took the chisel and, with slow but firm movements, corrected one of the cuts. Balthasar watched closely. For the first time, he learned from his father without feeling like a little boy. They worked all morning. Nicholas helped however he could, sanding the roughest parts and holding the boards while his father cut them. Jacinto supervised, patiently guiding each step, showing how to reinforce the joints and correct the angles. Balthasar, still clumsy, listened. At one point, Carmen came out to call them for lunch, but when she saw the scene, she stopped at the doorway. Her husband and father-in-law, sitting together, working on the same piece of wood. Nicholas, between them, watching, in fascination. She felt a lump in her throat. She said nothing. She just went back to the kitchen, hoping that scene would repeat many more times. When the sun began to set, the structure of the table was nearly finished. Jacinto ran a hand over the surface and nodded. "It's good wood," he said. Balthasar looked at the result with arms crossed. "It was harder than I expected," he admitted. The old man smiled. "The things that are worth it are never easy," he replied. Balthasar looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Jacinto handed him the chisel and stood up with effort. "The last detail is yours," he said. Balthasar took the tool and, with slow movements, made the final mark on the wood. When he finished, he sighed and set the chisel aside. He turned to his father. The old man looked at him with pride. Balthasar hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Father," he began, but the word felt strange in his mouth. The man looked at him patiently. Balthasar pressed his lips together. "I wasn't a good son," he said at last. Jacinto narrowed his eyes. "And I wasn't the best father either," he replied. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. The man, who suddenly felt like a boy again needing his father, lowered his gaze. "I always thought you hadn't given me anything," he murmured. "That I raised myself, that everything I achieved was because I earned it on my own." Jacinto didn't respond immediately. Balthasar looked up. "But when I saw Nicholas with you, I realized you gave him something more valuable than anything you could have given me," he confessed. Jacinto raised an eyebrow. "And what was that?" he asked. Balthasar exhaled with a barely noticeable smile. "Time." Jacinto felt something inside him loosen. He didn't have many words to say, but he didn't need them. Instead, he extended his hand. Baltasar looked at it for a moment, then grasped it firmly. "I'm sorry I didn't give you more of my time, son," he murmured with a hint of melancholy. "Now we have it," the man replied, not letting go of his father's hand. Several months later, the scent of cedar filled the air. In the small workshop behind the house, the sound of chisels and hammers echoed through the adobe-walled space. Jacinto sat in his usual chair, his cane leaning against the table, patiently watching every movement of his son and grandson. Nicolas, frowning, with the tip of his tongue barely sticking out between his lips, sanded the edges of a chair. Baltasar, beside him, measured the wood he would use for a table with precision. The workshop had been born from an idea that, at first, seemed like a dream too big. A month after building the first table together, Baltasar received a commission from the town. A shopkeeper needed new furniture for his store and, although he still didn't fully trust his own skills, he accepted the job. But he didn't do it alone. Jacinto taught him how to choose the best wood, how to join the pieces without forcing the cuts, and above all, how to bring each creation to life. Baltasar had the strength, but Jacinto had the experience. Nicolas, for his part, had the patience and dedication that his father sometimes lacked. Between the three of them, they turned the old storeroom of the house into a real carpentry workshop. The day they delivered the first table was unforgettable. Baltasar and Nicolas carried it to the shopkeeper's store, while Jacinto watched from the doorway, leaning on his cane. The client ran his hand over the surface, knocked on the wood with his knuckles, and after a pause that felt eternal, he smiled. "It's good work," he said. Baltasar felt he could breathe. For the first time in his life, someone recognized him for something he had built with his own hands. Nicolas looked at him with pride, and Jacinto, from a distance, nodded with satisfaction. That day, the shopkeeper placed another order. After that, more customers came. Within a few months, the small workshop became a real business. The orders kept coming. At first, it was just tables and chairs. Then, they started making doors, windows, more elaborate furniture. People in the town no longer saw Baltasar merely as the son of old Jacinto. Now, they sought him out for his work. But whenever someone asked who had taught him to make those pieces, Baltasar always gave the same honest answer: "My father." After so many months of growth, the workshop needed a name. One afternoon, while Nicolas was sanding a new piece and Jacinto watched from his chair, Baltasar took a knife and began carving something into the beam above the entrance. When he finished, Nicolas came closer to read, "Carpinteria Jacinto." The old man blinked, surprised. Baltasar put the knife away and crossed his arms. "If it weren't for you, none of this would exist," he said firmly. Jacinto didn't know what to say, but in his moist eyes, Baltasar found the only answer he needed. Carmen, although she never worked in the workshop, began to get involved in other ways. She made sure there was coffee when the workdays ran long. She made sure there was enough food for everyone. And although she never admitted it out loud, more than once she was seen sweeping up sawdust from the floor when no one was looking. Her relationship with Jacinto slowly improved. When she looked at the old man, when she saw her husband happy and her son learning, her heart filled with love. In the end, without meaning to, God had given her the opportunity she never had with her own parents, to enjoy time with her family. And so, dear friends, we reach the end of this story. I loved sharing it with you, and I hope you enjoyed hearing it. Don't forget to subscribe and give it a like so we can continue bringing you stories of kindness, love, gratitude, and hope. Leave me a comment if you liked it. I send you a hug, and I'll see you in the next story.